Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 259 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technology firm that helps clients manage risk across four key areas: sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, which of course includes employees and contractors. For more information, you can contact view the Red Flag Group's website at www.redflaggroup.com. Also, if you're going to be in Atlanta, Minneapolis, Dallas, or Houston over the next couple of weeks, I hope you will consider coming by the Red Flag Group Roundtable that I will be leading in those cities. In Atlanta on June 16th, Minneapolis June 22, Dallas June 23, and Houston June 24. You can also get more information on those at the Red Flag Group website, which is www.redflaggroup.com. In today's podcast, I have a real treat for you. I have Dani Perez. Dani is with Cuba Cultural Travel. He was the tour leader who led my State Bar of Texas International Section group to Cuba. Dani is Cuban-American. He has relatives still living in Cuba. He's traveled to Cuba both personally and professionally, and I thought it would be good to get his thoughts on where relations between the United States might be going with Cuba. He's got a lot of insight because he's been down there a few times, and obviously with his business, he has traveled professionally. Dani's also a recovering lawyer, so he's one of us. So I hope you will enjoy it. The episode comes in at just over 25 minutes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today you are in for a real treat. We're going to go in a little bit different direction. Nevertheless, I think it's very appropriate to FCPA Compliance and Ethics. I have with me Dani Sanchez, and Dani was one of the professional tour guides who led my tour group, the State Bar of Texas International Section, on my recent trip to Cuba. As many of you know, I blogged about this, and I've been bugging Dani for a while because he has a really interesting story, and I wanted to get him on to talk about what it's like to do business in Cuba, because that's something he does professionally. So, Dani, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure to talk again. And my name is Dani Perez. I think you said Sanchez there.
Yeah.
Anyway, Tom invited me to speak today, and I'm happy to be here. I am an attorney, a young attorney who recently transitioned into doing Cuba tours on a full-time basis. And it's an exciting time in Cuba, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of information with your audience, Tom.
So, Dani, I can't remember if I told you, but once upon a time I transitioned out of the practice of law as well, and probably got more comments from people who wanted to do that but didn't have the courage to do so. So kudos to you for following your passion. But tell us, why don't you tell us who you work for and what your company does?
Sure. I work with Cuba Cultural Travel. The company's been doing tours primarily in the people-to-people category for over 15 years. Our president, Michael Sykes, has been traveling to Cuba extensively since the 90s. And we do all sorts of tours, mainly in the cultural domain, artistic, dance, musical tours, tours for museums, tours for organizations, student groups. I've been brought in to work on the professional association trips that we do as well, particularly bar associations, which we've been seeing a lot more interest for these days. And typically, the standard tour would involve traveling to Cuba on a bar trip, for instance, maybe 4 or 5 nights, where we immerse ourselves in learning about the Cuban legal system from various individuals and law professors, but also mix in cultural elements to really get to know the island, the culture, the people, which provides an extra level of context for understanding the legal system there. And just ever since Obama, really decided to make Cuba an initiative of foreign policy, we've been seeing a huge demand in travel. As well, more and more regulations are coming out to make it easier for people to visit Cuba, and we're all anticipating the commercial airfare to start up here real soon as well. So,
Dani, for those who may not know what a people-to-people exchange is, could you explain that?
absolutely, people-to-people category was first introduced in the Clinton administration, and it was designed to allow Americans to visit Cuba legally, to engage the Cuban people, to have a meaningful interaction with Cuban people, actual Cuban individuals, also within an educational context. The regulations and license categories have been redefined over the years depending on the administration's priorities. But the people-to-people category is really meant to allow for a cultural exchange, an educational exchange between American citizens and Cuban citizens. This category was nixed during the Bush administration and was brought back by President Obama in 2011. And we've seen a lot of travel under this category. Most recently, the Treasury Department regulations now allow individuals to engage in this sort of travel as well.
So, Dani, I believe you told me that you went on full time with the company at the start of the year, but you'd previously done a couple of trips. Could you tell us really what you've seen change in the time you've been involved with the professional side of people-to-people exchanges?
Sure. I started doing them in 2015. Well, I've traveled on a number of them over the years, actually, but I started working as an escort and guide for some bar association trips starting in 2015. And, really, in addition to just the general increase in interest and demand for this type of travel from the U.S. side, the Cubans have been, the attitude has been shifting quite a bit. They're more welcoming of Americans in general, and you've seen a lot of Cuban individuals, professionals, more willing to put themselves out there as individuals. It's probably a result of changing conditions in Cuba. There's a lot more opportunity for private enterprise, and independent economic activity is increasingly authorized in Cuba. So you're seeing a lot of professionals look for other ways to market themselves, and a little bit of less red tape operating within the private sector. We're seeing a lot of development in private restaurants and paladars, and just gorgeous, beautiful restaurants that Cubans have been making out of their homes in a very authentically Cuban manner. Many of these projects may be financed from family or friends from abroad, but they truly are family operations, and they're employing very well many Cubans, young and older Cubans that are looking to enter the private sector for the first time. And so as the Cubans themselves have more opportunities, they're realizing how networking works, and to market themselves as service providers as tourism is increasing, and will only continue to do so for the immediate future.
Danny, a couple of things struck me on the tour I was on, which was like I said, a bar sponsored tour, at least organized by members of the Texas State Bar. And kind of the first general observation was that people we met with were very interested and indeed eager to communicate to us Americans not only the expectations they had on doing business in Cuba, but also the opportunities. And to explain to us, yes, we do live in a socialist system, and there are certain rules, there are certain government agencies, departments that you're going to have to talk to, but we want to move forward in this manner, and we see this as a I don't know if you call it growth opportunity or positive for Cuba, but they were very much in favor of talking to us and doing business with us. Would that be a fair observation from your end?
I think absolutely. There's increasingly open relations, and I think that's been the case for some time actually. However, now that our governments are talking, so to speak, and on first name basis, the fear, the context of animosity between our countries is kind of melting away, and so many government officials are engaging us more freely without a concern of what may result from becoming too close to United States organization. There's less paranoia, and they're teaching English in school. It's whereas in the past it was Russian. We're talking about during the Cold War,
right?
But there's just the overall attitude has shifted, and yes, they're very open to doing business with us. We're their neighbor, and I think the attitude has shifted quite a bit. And that should only continue going forward. Whether these government officials are in positions where they can actually make that happen, time will tell.
The other general observation I had was particularly with the Cuban lawyers we met with was their age, and they were quite young. And part of that, I think, is the Cuban legal educational system is a little bit different than the American system, because you can start practicing after our equivalent of undergrad. But also it struck me that may be where one of the big changes comes, that because the generations on both sides of the fence who were involved in the late 50s and early 60s are really on the wane, that the younger generations from both our countries may see the advantage in having closer relationships with two peoples who are literally 90 miles from each other. Would that be a fair assessment as well?
I think the younger generation is generally more open, but in terms of the age of lawyers, I would say that it's unlike here in the United States. For instance, let's say becoming a judge. That's something that typically happens towards the later part of your legal career here in the United States, whereas in Cuba, being a judge could actually be part of your service following law school. Cubans attend law school completely free as long as they're accepted, as well as other higher education. They may have a choice. They may not have a choice when graduating, but serving as a judge is something that you would do right out of law school. Not to say that there aren't career judges as well in Cuba, but that's very common to see. So some cultural differences. I think they don't. They're a civil law system, so maybe not being an expert in the civil law, but maybe that's something that the ability to serve as a judge in the civil law system may not have the same requirements as a common law system. But I think the youth, you have the question of youth is very complicated in Cuba right now because many of them still are confronted with the situation of mixed incentives to pursue professional careers. The best opportunities are in tourism and in the private sector, and the practice of law is not. There's no private practice of law in Cuba, so you really have to want to be a lawyer or a doctor. You have to work on a state salary. Of course, there are ways Cubans, get around that and have other jobs, but more or less they're not going to be making the kind of wages that a taxi driver would, or someone working in a hotel or a private restaurant catering to tourists. I'm astonished to meet so many young, bright Cubans that have ambitions, and they are, pursuing, legal careers and becoming doctors, despite the fact that they're not going to earn the type of wages that they might otherwise need. And then you have another group of Cubans who, still to this day want to leave the country, and many are leaving now to, choosing to take the opportunity to make it to the U.S. before the Cuban Adjustment Act may or may not get repealed. And so you have an attitude, a mixed attitude. It's a moment in time in Cuba that's challenging for young people because they will have to have a perspective to pursue higher education in a long-term, with a long-term view. Many are choosing to, work in the street, take odd-end jobs within the private sector or directly within the authorized private sector, rather than pursuing higher education. I'm sorry, there's a roundabout answer to your question, but hopefully some of that is interesting for your audience.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things you recently did a trip to Cuba with a family member. Is there really any difference in the type of trip I went on, which was through your company in a cultural exchange, and then your trip home with your grandmother, or her home, I guess?
Yeah.
The sort of differences there?
Sure. Yeah, I had the opportunity to travel with my grandmother, who was born in Cuba, and her first visit back to the islands since the 50s. She left for the United States before the revolution there in Cuba. Had always talked about going back, and finally had the time to go with her, and incredibly emotional experience for her, and a wonderful trip. In terms of the differences, I mean, there are differences in the license categories. There are people-to-people is one category of authorized travel to Cuba. Family travel is another, and so there are different conditions to satisfying the license category. However, for most of them, it amounts to maintaining a full-time schedule of activities in accordance with that license category. So, we're at a point now where the enforcement, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, Division of the Treasury Department, enforces these Cuba travel restrictions. We're at a moment in time where they're not really watching things closely. Itineraries, previously itineraries would have to be sent in advance of travel, get approved, and that's not happening now. We're operating in more of an honor system, where all of the license categories are by general license, meaning you don't have to send a request for approval to travel. You travel in accordance with the conditions of the category, and you shouldn't have any problems. So, it was really, with my grandmother, it was a blend of, we did meet with family. We found some additional family just by looking in the phone book, I was traveling with my aunt as well. But we did many activities that you might consider people-to-people type activities as well in our trip, as well as activities in support of the Cuban people. And another licensed category is support for the Cuban people. In terms of what it authorizes for travel, you can engage in activities in Cuba that are supportive of the Cuban people, and the way that those have been redefined of late include activities in support of the private sector. So, we were staying in Airbnbs, casas particulares, rental homes. These are private businesses of Cubans converting their homes into vacation rentals, and predominantly ate at all private restaurants as well, which is also supportive of the Cuban people as the regulations provide currently.
Danny, I was really intrigued with your story of how you are transitioning, or maybe even have transitioned out of the practice of law and into your current role. And I think that's something that all lawyers maybe dream about. So why don't you tell us, what you did when you were in big law and corporate law, and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, it's been a dream. I think before I even went into law school, I had a feeling I didn't want to be a lawyer my whole life, but went ahead and jumped in and did fairly well in law school, and took a job with Milbank Tweed in New York City. I'm from San Diego. I grew up in California my whole life. Went to undergrad at UC Davis in Northern California, and George Washington in DC, and was in part motivated to go study international law in DC with my interest in Cuba. I traveled first as an undergrad there, but I took a job with Milbank Tweed. They had an interesting Latin American business practice, interesting technology transactions outsourcing group I was in for, and there's a whole another podcast and a whole other conversation on why I'm not wasn't a good fit for me in Milbank, but had great people there, great mentors, and I think more maybe big law wasn't for me, but also New York City wasn't for me, and I moved back home to California. I had an 8-year-old sister that I wanted to be part of her life, and so after about a year and a half at Milbank, I left the firm and had about a year period where I was actually doing some private practice, immigration and some export control related to Cuba matters, but ultimately ended up in-house counsel here in Carlsbad with the company, and at that point I thought I'd found it, very comfortable, felt like my experiences at Milbank were quite helpful for the in-house role, and spent over 4 years with TSG Solutions in Carlsbad, GIS, cybersecurity, interesting products and services in those areas. And at that time, over the course of my time working in Carlsbad, I came to meet some people here in San Diego area that were involved in Cuba. While I was in DC and New York, I was very active in various organizations promoting engagement with Cuba, and I reached out to some folks here in the San Diego County area, and one of those was Michael Sykes, the president of Cuba Cultural Travel. He lives up here in Fallbrook, North County, San Diego, and we struck up a friendship, and as more and more bar associations came knocking at his door, Michael suggested that I help out with some of his groups, and that started in 2015, and the rest is history. I started doing that on a vacation basis, taking time away, but seemed like I loved it so much. It was it was my calling, and there's enough demand for me to jump right in. So here I am. We're in the off season now with Cuban Cultural Travel, but it's quite busy. We're signing up various bar associations and groups for the coming season. I have a few groups out there now, but generally the summertime is slower. The heat discourages some travel, but that's my story, which led me to Cuba Cultural Travel. Couldn't be happier.
Well, Dani, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I was wondering if anyone wanted to follow up with you directly or learn more about Cuba Cultural Travel. Is there a website they could go to, or could they email you?
Absolutely. The website is www.cubaculturaltravel.com, and my email address is daniel@cubaculturaltravel.com. So your listeners are welcome to contact us, whether they want to travel as a group or just need any tips on getting to Cuba and having a great time there. I'd be happy to talk to them.
Well, I'll just throw in a plug. If you're listening and you want to go to Cuba, this is the guy to call, and this is the tour group to go through. My experience was nothing but fabulous the entire time. So, Dani, I really want to thank you for taking the time to visit with me. I'm hoping that you and I can continue this discussion, because I think eventually there will be a political solution, and it just makes too much sense for both countries. So I'm hoping we can all move forward.
Absolutely. I look forward to the next conversation, Tom.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode on the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report, which is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. I hope you will consider going to Cuba. I found it to be one of the great experiences of my travel career. It's going to change pretty dramatically. U.S. Airlines have just received permission to land in Cuba, so there's going to be a lot of travel opening up. I also suggest that you call Dani Perez at Cuba Cultural Travel if you're interested in a group, and because he puts together a fabulous package. It's definitely first class, and he's there for all your travel tour needs. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.